There are moments in history that seem impossible to imagine today. Moments so extraordinary that, if they hadn't been documented, they would sound like fiction. This is one of those moments. Imagine walking into a stadium with nearly 200,000 other people, already convinced your team has won the biggest prize in world football. Not hopeful. Not optimistic. Certain. Imagine newspapers already celebrating the victory before the match has even been played. Imagine your government preparing for a national celebration. Imagine parents telling their children, "Today, you'll witness history." Now imagine leaving that same stadium in complete silence. No songs. No cheers. No conversations. Only the sound of thousands of footsteps echoing through the streets of Rio de Janeiro. That silence would haunt an entire nation for decades. This is the story of the Maracanazo. The day football taught Brazil that certainty can be far more dangerous than defeat. To understand why this match mattered so much, we have to travel back to a world trying to heal itself. The year was 1950. Only 5 years had passed since the end of the Second World War. Across Europe, cities were still rebuilding. Families were still grieving. For 12 long years, the FIFA World Cup had disappeared. The tournaments scheduled for 1942 and 1946 were cancelled because of the war. Now, for the first time since 1938, football's greatest competition had returned. And Brazil had been chosen to host it. For Brazil, this wasn't simply an opportunity to organize a tournament. It was an opportunity to introduce itself to the world. The country wanted to show that its future would be brighter than its past. Nothing represented that ambition more than a gigantic new stadium built in Rio de Janeiro. The Estadio do Maracanã. When construction began, people questioned whether such a stadium was even necessary. It was enormous. Far larger than almost anything football had ever seen. But Brazilian officials believed the World Cup deserved a stage unlike any other. They weren't simply building a football stadium. They were building a monument to national confidence. Every brick carried the weight of expectation. Every seat represented a dream. And as the tournament unfolded, it appeared those dreams were about to come true. Brazil played breathtaking football. They scored goals for fun. Spain were crushed. Sweden were overwhelmed. Supporters didn't just believe Brazil would become world champions. They began wondering by how many goals they would win. That confidence spread everywhere. It appeared in newspapers. It appeared in conversations. It appeared in the streets. Some newspapers even published celebratory headlines before the decisive match had taken place. Victory felt inevitable. All that remained was one final obstacle. Uruguay. On paper, Uruguay were respected. After all, they had already won the first World Cup in 1930. But compared to the unstoppable Brazilian attack, many believed they simply couldn't compete. Brazil didn't even need to win. A draw would be enough to secure the championship. Think about that for a moment. 90 minutes. 1 point. One final step. Everything seemed perfectly arranged. On the morning of July 16, 1950, Rio de Janeiro woke up in celebration rather than anticipation. Vendors sold flags. Children painted their faces. Families traveled together toward the Maracanã wearing white, the color of Brazil's national team at the time. People smiled at strangers. The atmosphere felt less like a sporting event and more like a national holiday. No one wanted to miss the birth of history. By midday, an extraordinary river of humanity was flowing toward the stadium. From every direction they came. Workers, students, soldiers, politicians, grandparents, young children sitting on their fathers' shoulders. Nearly 200,000 people would squeeze into the Maracanã that afternoon, creating one of the largest crowds football has ever witnessed. If you had stood outside the stadium and listened carefully, you would have heard only one conversation. Not whether Brazil would win, but how Brazil would celebrate. Yet inside another room, hidden beneath the concrete stands, the mood could not have been more different. The Uruguayan dressing room was quiet. The players had heard the predictions. They had seen the newspaper headlines. They understood that almost nobody believed they could win. Their captain, Obdulio Varela, looked around the room. He knew something his opponents had forgotten. Matches are not won by headlines. They are not won by crowds. They are not won by predictions. They are won on the pitch. For 90 minutes, every player begins equal. As the teams emerged from the tunnel, the sound inside the Maracana became almost impossible to describe. It wasn't cheering anymore. It was a force of nature. Nearly 200,000 voices merged into one deafening roar that rolled around the stadium like thunder. Brazilian flags danced across the terraces. Musicians beat drums high above the stands. Some supporters closed their eyes, whispering prayers. Others smiled with complete confidence. Across the pitch, the Uruguayan players looked tiny against the sea of white that surrounded them. It felt as though they weren't playing 11 men. They were playing an entire country. When the referee finally blew his whistle, every touch by a Brazilian player was greeted with applause. Every Uruguayan pass was met with whistles. Every tackle drew gasps from the crowd. The opening minutes belonged to Brazil. Not because they created endless chances, but because they played with the calm confidence of a team convinced destiny was already on its side. Uruguay defended patiently. They didn't rush. They didn't panic. Their captain, Obdulio Varela, seemed almost untouched by the noise. Whenever one of his teammates looked anxious, he spoke quietly, slowly, confidently. He knew something many leaders understand. Panic spreads quickly, but so does calm. Brazil attacked again. Then again. The crowd rose to its feet every few minutes, expecting the breakthrough. But Uruguay refused to break. Minute after minute, the score remained unchanged. 0-0. Something subtle began to happen. Not on the pitch, but in the minds of the spectators. The excitement that had filled the stadium before kickoff slowly transformed into impatience. A missed pass that would have been ignored 15 minutes earlier now drew frustrated sighs. A misplaced cross was greeted with nervous laughter. For the first time that afternoon, people started looking at the clock. Still, there was no real fear. After all, Brazil didn't need to win. A draw was enough. The first half ended exactly as it had begun. Scoreless. As the players disappeared down the tunnel, many supporters remained relaxed. Some laughed. Others discussed how long it would take Brazil to score after the break. Even inside the Brazilian dressing room, there was confidence. The plan hadn't changed. Keep attacking. Stay patient. The goal would come. Across the corridor, however, the atmosphere inside the Uruguayan dressing room was remarkably different. No celebrations. No relief. No satisfaction with holding Brazil. Obdulio Varela looked at his teammates and reminded them of something that history often forgets. Pressure doesn't belong to the underdog. Pressure belongs to the favorite. Every minute that passed without a Brazilian goal increased that pressure. Every minute gave Uruguay something priceless. Belief. When the players returned for the second half, nobody in the stadium realized they were about to witness one of the greatest emotional swings in sporting history. Only 2 minutes after the restart, it happened. Brazil finally found the breakthrough. Friaca burst forward, met the pass perfectly, and drove the ball beyond the goalkeeper. For a heartbeat, there was silence. The kind of silence that exists only because an entire crowd inhales at exactly the same moment. Then the Maracana exploded. The sound was so overwhelming that players later admitted they could barely hear one another. People embraced complete strangers. Hats flew into the air. Flags waved wildly in every direction. Some supporters were already crying. Children climbed onto the shoulders of their fathers, believing they were witnessing the greatest moment Brazilian football had ever known. Outside the stadium, fireworks were set off. Inside, chants of Brazil, 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 echoed endlessly around the concrete walls. If football matches could end through emotion alone, this one would have been over. It was the perfect script. Brazil had scored. They still needed only a draw. Surely now, there was no way back. But football has never cared about perfect scripts. And neither did Uruguay. While thousands celebrated in the stands, one man picked up the ball from inside his own net. Obdulio Varela didn't run. He didn't shout. Instead, He walked slowly toward the referee. He questioned the goal. Not because he expected it to be disallowed, but because every second he delayed the restart allowed something else to happen. The crowd grew quieter. The celebrations cooled. His teammates caught their breath. The rhythm of the match changed. Years later, many people would call it one of the greatest acts of leadership football has ever seen. He understood something extraordinary. The match wasn't only being played with feet. It was now being played inside people's minds. Brazil believed they had already crossed the finish line. Uruguay had only just begun the race. Brazil had only one job now. Protect the lead. Protect the draw. Protect the dream. But dreams have a strange habit. The harder you try to hold on to them, the easier they slip away. Something invisible had changed. Not the score. Not yet. The momentum. Uruguay suddenly began moving with a confidence they hadn't shown all afternoon. Passes that had seemed cautious now became sharper. Challenges became stronger. The players who had spent the first half surviving were now asking questions. Brazil answered at first. They cleared crosses. They blocked shots. But with every attack, another tiny seed was planted inside the minds of nearly 200,000 people. What if? It was only a whisper. Barely noticeable. But whispers have a way of becoming fear. The Brazilian crowd, so loud only minutes earlier, was changing. The singing became less frequent. The drums slowed. People who had been standing sat down. Some supporters looked at the giant clock instead of the pitch. Others folded their arms. No one spoke about it. But everyone felt it. Then it happened. Uruguay attacked down the left. The move wasn't spectacular. It wasn't unstoppable. It was simply patient. One pass. Then another. The Brazilian defense hesitated for the briefest moment. Just enough. Juan Alberto Schiaffino met the cross first time. The ball flew beyond Barbosa. The net rippled. For a second, nobody reacted. The stadium didn't know how to react. Brazil was still champions. A draw was enough. But something much more valuable than the score had disappeared. Confidence. Uruguay didn't celebrate wildly. There was no need. They had achieved something far greater than an equalizer. They had made Brazil doubt itself. Inside the Maracanã, an emotion the crowd had never expected to experience that afternoon slowly spread from one stand to another. Anxiety. You could see it everywhere. Fathers stopped smiling. Children looked toward their parents, searching their faces for reassurance. Reporters in the press box crossed out headlines they had already written. Even the photographers behind the goal changed position. Instinct told them the story wasn't over. On the touchline, Brazil urged themselves forward again. They attacked because attacking was all they knew. But now every mistake felt heavier. Every misplaced pass drew groans from the crowd. Every missed opportunity felt like time slipping through their fingers. Across the pitch, Obdulio Varela sensed it. He didn't need a scoreboard to know who held the advantage. Football is played with legs. Championships are won with minds. Uruguay now possessed the calmer minds. The next attack began almost unnoticed. There was no dramatic build-up. No music. No warning. Just another movement down the right side. Alcides Ghiggia received the ball near the touchline. A defender backed away, expecting the cross. Another player moved toward the center, preparing to intercept it. Even Barbosa, Brazil's goalkeeper, shifted his weight ever so slightly. Everyone believed they knew what Ghiggia was about to do. Cross the ball. That was the obvious choice. It was the correct choice. It was the expected choice. Ghiggia saw the same picture everyone else saw. Then, he ignored it. Instead of crossing, he drove toward the near post. For the smallest fraction of a second, time seemed to slow. Barbosa adjusted. Too late. Ghiggia struck the ball low and hard. It slipped between the goalkeeper and the post. The net moved. No roar. No explosion. No celebration. Only silence. Not because the goal hadn't counted, but because almost 200,000 people needed a moment to accept what their eyes had just witnessed. Brazil were losing. The impossible had happened. The World Cup was slipping away. And an entire nation could do nothing except watch. For what felt like an eternity, nobody moved. The Brazilian players stood frozen. Some stared at the referee. Others stared at the ground. A few simply looked toward the crowd, searching for the same answer every supporter was asking. How? How had this happened? There were still minutes left to play. Enough time for one more attack. One more chance. One more miracle. The roar finally returned. Not with confidence, but with desperation. Nearly 200,000 people pleaded with their team. Every Brazilian attack carried the weight of an entire nation. Every clearance by Uruguay was greeted with relief from 11 exhausted men who understood they were protecting far more than a one-goal lead. The clock became Brazil's greatest enemy. Every second disappeared faster than the last. Every throw-in felt too slow. Every stoppage felt unbearable. Uruguay defended with discipline, with courage, with absolute belief. Then, the referee looked at his watch, raised the whistle, and history changed forever. The match was over. Uruguay had done the impossible. Against every prediction. Against the expectations of an entire nation. Against one of the largest crowds football had ever seen. They were world champions. The celebration belonged to a nation of just a few million people. The heartbreak belonged to everyone else inside the Maracanã. What happened next has become almost mythical. Many accounts describe an eerie silence settling over the stadium. Not the silence of an empty arena. The silence of nearly 200,000 people trying to process the unimaginable. Some supporters remained in their seats long after the players had left the pitch. Others walked slowly toward the exits without saying a word. Many cried openly. Some couldn't. They were simply numb. Brazil had prepared for a coronation. Instead, they attended a funeral for a dream. Years later, Alcides Ghiggia, the man who scored the winning goal, said something that perfectly captured that afternoon. Only 3 people have ever silenced the Maracanã. Frank Sinatra, the Pope, and me. It wasn't arrogance. It was history. For Brazil, the consequences reached far beyond one defeat. The white shirts worn by the national team became a painful reminder of that afternoon. Eventually, Brazil abandoned them forever. The famous yellow jersey the world now associates with Brazilian football was born from the ashes of the Maracanazo. Players carried the scars for the rest of their lives. None more than goalkeeper Moacir Barbosa. Many unfairly blamed him for the decisive goal. By sunset, Brazil hadn't just lost a football match. It had lost something far more dangerous. The belief that destiny could never betray them. For decades, Barbosa carried a burden no single player should ever have to bear. But history has a strange way of rewarding resilience. Sometimes, the greatest victories are born from the deepest defeats. 8 years later, a skinny 17-year-old boy walked onto a World Cup pitch in Sweden. He remembered watching his father cry after Brazil's defeat in 1950. As a child, he had made a promise. One day, I will win the World Cup for Brazil. Most childhood promises disappear with time. This one changed football forever. The boy's name was Pelé. And that is where our next story begins. If you enjoyed this journey through one of football's greatest moments, subscribe and join us for the next chapter. Because sometimes, the greatest footballers are not created by victory. They are created by heartbreak.